Welcome to the Good Shepherd and the Child podcast, where we explore the spirituality of the Christian child through the method of the catechesis of the Good Shepherd. I am your host, Carrie Mecchi-Lozano. Today we have a very special guest. We have Karin Slabaugh on the podcast to dive into a really beautiful woman who we don't hear much about, but whose influence on both the Montessori world and our world in the catechesis of the Good Shepherd is rather large. So Adele Costa Gnocchi was friends with Sofia Cavalletti and even had a little Montessori school right across the street from Sofia's home. And she is the one who first asked Sofia if she would meet with a child that then became a few children to help them prepare for some sacraments. And after that experience, Sofia spoke more with Adele, and that's when Adele Costa Gnocchi paired up Sofia Cavalletti with Gianna Gobi. So she is the matchmaker of these two best friends. And as Gianna and Sofia continued to observe the child and experiment in this work, they first started in Adele's little Montessori school that was right across the street, and it wasn't until later that they moved it to Sofia's home. And it was also Adele who encouraged them to make what they were doing official, like fill out the paperwork and actually become something official. So it's neat to learn about the connection between this beautiful soul, Adele Costa Gnocchi, and Sofia and Gianna, because you can see so many of the beautiful seeds of Montessori that was planted by Adele, and then how it took fruit, both in her own Montessori work, but also in our work in the catechesis of the Good Shepherd. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Karin and really dive into who is Adele Costa Gnocchi. I hope you enjoy. Welcome, Karin, to the Good Shepherd and the Child podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, Karin, let's learn about who you are. Who are you? And I'd love to hear about your involvement in the Montessori world.
Okay, well, let's see. So I am originally from the United States, but I live in Italy. So I'm an expat, so to speak. I left my country for Montessori. I left my country to do the research about the 0 to 3 Montessori history and the movement as it developed over here, which is very different from the international movement. So I was really wanting to know more about it and just made the move. But I always worked with children, even though I never got formally educated I didn't get a college degree in education. I wasn't a teacher. But I did, every time I had a choice about a project or an internship or something, it was always with children. And then I finally ended up taking the Birth to 3 Montessori training. And I wanted to do it in Italy. I wanted to come to Italy and do it in Italian because I'm a purist. So I wanted to do it with Montessori's language. Mm-hmm. And I ended up helping my sister with her babies. So I was living as her nanny, so to speak, in home. And the two of us were, collaborating for the first 3 years of her 2 children's lives. So the first 4 years, they were just a year apart. And that really cemented in me my love for the littlest ones, what Montessori called I piccolissimi. So I had worked for years in a French immersion school with the little ones. So that meant the 2 to the 4-year-olds. And I had done a lot of preschool environmental education out in the field with different school groups coming through. And so when I finally did my Montessori education and I did the 0 to 3, I really wanted to work in the classroom with the babies, with the first year of life or the first year and a half. But there were very few of those classrooms at the time. And so I worked in the toddler environment, and I just fell in love with that age group. They are such amazing people. So that's, I guess, not so much about who I am as I jumped right into my Montessori
No, that's perfect.
background.
Well, lead us into what you are doing now.
So, because I was always pointed at the youngest ones, in my Montessori training, that I ended up with a master's degree because our program allowed us to go get another set of credits and then turn it into an official master's degree, which was a real wonderful thing. Before, it was just a Montessori diploma, which didn't carry any academic weight in the world. And I was really interested in the youngest ones because in our observations we are to observe newborns, and most every student in that program found it impossible to observe newborns because every new mom really protects her privacy, rightfully so. And so I came to Rome on this quest to understand the history of the 0 to 3 Montessori work. And I went to see my trainer, who her name is Dr. Montanaro. She may have been the topic of some of your podcasts. And she was the one who helped the students find observations for newborns in Rome in the very, very, very first training she did. So I went to her and I said, "Can you help me, do some newborn observations?" And she said, "Oh no, that's impossible. You can't. I can't get you into any of the hospital." I mean, it was back in the day that she was getting people into these hospitals to observe newborns. So what I'm doing today, when I moved to Italy, I did that for a project which turned into a public health care program in Italy, sponsored by the Italian government, to do a Montessori training for their public nurse midwives. And for 3 years, or about 2.5 years actually, I was able to go into 3 different hospitals and not only observe newborns at will. So I had one of those white jackets that made me look like a doctor, and I had carte blanche. And so I was able to observe births, I was able to observe labors, I was able to observe postpartum, I was able to observe the babies in that golden first hour, 2 hours. I was able to observe the relationships, the mother-child relationships as they were coming into existence. And so ever since, I've been focusing my Montessori work on the newborn. But I'm also just very passionate about that whole first phase, which I tend to say 0 to 2 years. The Montessori movement puts all 3 first years together, but the 2 to 3-year-old, as you know, is a very different phase. And the 0 to 2 is kind of that very, very sensitive, that spiritual embryo, as Maria Montessori called it.
Yeah. I didn't realize that you were trained by Silvana Montanaro. That's really neat because we're going to be talking about Adele, which is one of those people who bridges the Montessori world from our catechesis of the Good Shepherd world. But Silvana is another one of those bridges. And I didn't realize that you were so connected to her. That's really neat.
Yeah, there's a funny story that goes with that because I really wanted to, like I said, do my Montessori training in Italy. And originally I had looked into the 3 to 6 in Perugia. And there is a training center there that I was intending to go to. And I wasn't able to do it at that time. That was when I chose to live with my sister and work with her and her children for those years. And so when I came back from that experience, I wanted to do the 0 to 3 and no longer the 3 to 6. But I still wanted to do it in Italy. So I looked on the website, the Association Montessori International website for the training, and it listed Montanaro's Rome contacts. So I
Oh, wow.
So I did, and I had no idea that she was no longer working in Rome. Those were the early days. But, just as websites are, they don't get updated. So I was like, oh, I get to go to Rome. And I wrote a letter and I called the phone number and it turned out to be Dr. Montanoro's home phone number, and
Oh, wow.
someone answered and says, oh no, there's no Montessori trainings going on here anymore. So she was at that point coming to San Diego, California. And so that's where I did my training with her.
That's really neat. That's really neat. Well, let's dive into Adele Costa Gnocchi. Would you tell us about who this unheard of giant in the Montessori, especially 0 to 3 world, who is she?
Oh, let's see. So Adele Costa Gnocchi was born in 1883. So that was 13 years after Maria Montessori. She was born in Umbria, in a tiny, tiny town, to an aristocratic family. I think her father was a lawyer. I'm not exactly sure, but they were a wealthy. They weren't noble born, because the class of people at that time. The different classes. There was the wealthy class. There was the noble class. And so Adele was born into a family, one of 4 daughters, and they got educated at home. Private tutors and teachers came into the home. Mm-hmm. So she and all her sisters had, incredible educations, and she was in a part of Italy that one might describe as kind of a spiritual center, because St. Francis is from the town just up the road. St. Clair is from Assisi as well. Mm-hmm. And her mother was deeply religious. So Adele Costa Gnocchi decided in her 20s to devote her life to her work for God, and chose not to marry, and she never did. She was very entrepreneurial in the sense of she wanted to do good, to do good works. Mm-hmm. And so she started a school with a childhood friend of hers. And there's another book about her, is not about her, but another book on her. Recently it was published. It's a 50 years of letters. It's an epistolario. It's all the letters she wrote to this friend, Mariana. And so she and Mariana started a school for young women in order to help them rise out of dependence of having to marry and be dependent on husbands. So a very, very early feminist. Mm-hmm. And it was teaching embroidery. So helping women garnish a skill that then they could make a livelihood off of. So that is why she was invited to Maria Montessori's very first course. So in 1907, Montessori started the Children's House, as it's known today. Mm-hmm. Before that, she'd been working with children that had been taken out of an insane asylum where adults had been. And so she had been working with children already. But in 1907, and for 2 years, she worked in the very first Children's House. And at the end of that time, she offered a training for the very first time to share what she had learned. And Adele Costa Gnocchi was invited to that training because the woman who was hosting that very first training had handpicked Adele as someone who would be perfect for this work, because this woman's name was Alice Franchetti. She was married to a baron, so she was an American-born woman, much younger than the baron, but she was married into this nobility. And so just by chance, she was brought into this Montessori world because she was a neighbor, and Alice knew of her and her work with women and her school. So Adele then went and got her teaching degree after she did her Montessori school, after Montessori's very first offering. And she decided she was going to get this teaching degree and teach and be a teacher. She didn't actually ever teach as a Children's House, educator or directress, as they were called at the time. She had a job teaching high school philosophy. And she worked, so she moved to Rome after she got that teaching degree, and she worked in it was a convent orphanage school. and it was a boarding school. And she was one of the professors there, and she did her whole career there. 35 years of work with the sisters that were doing this beautiful educational work with older children. But in the 20s, she opened up her what she called her study, because she was really wanting to study children in the Montessori method. And that was what she was most famous for, was this place that was called La Scuoletta. So the little school, La Scuoletta. And she called it my study. La scuoletta è mio studio, non è una scuola. This isn't a school. This is my my experimental, my research lab, where I study children. And she even managed to keep it open during Mussolini's period of fascism, because he closed all the Montessori schools. And she had this beautiful little program that was famous in all of Rome, for the quality of what happened in there for the children, the quality of the children's experience.
Do you know if that is why she didn't name the school a Montessori school, because she didn't want it to be closed during that time period, like all the other Montessori schools? Is that why she just called it a little school?
Well, yeah, it would be hard to understand motives like that. There's so much misinformation running around the Montessori world. Books are written, biographies are written, and sometimes it's not correct. So I'll refrain from making but what I do know is she was probably one of the most loyal Montessorians. She didn't, she understood what Maria Montessori was talking about and applied it, I think, more perfectly than anyone else. And she was also rapidly independent. So she was working for God, not for Maria Montessori, so she was truly doing this work of understanding children, because she said, Montessori wasn't the number one aspect of my life. Doing God's work was the number one aspect of my life. But using what Maria Montessori showed the world to do God's work was how she carried out God's plan for her.
That's really neat. Yeah. It seems like that was a similar calling from what Maria as well felt, as well as the women who started Catechesis of Good Shepherd.
Yeah. All of the people that followed Maria Montessori on this mission, this pilgrimage, because it truly was committing one's life to the mission. Often they didn't marry and have families, because it required so much of you. It wasn't like Maria Montessori created a religion and had sisters that she was ordaining, but in a way it kind of was. It was truly a flock. The women that followed Montessori were a flock of missionaries and of women that were fully immersed and devoted in the mission of the child.
So tell us about how Adele started working with the youngest child.
Well, so this is kind of something that Maria Montessori and Adele Costa Gnocchi both shared, was this realization that, you just have to keep going backwards to, the younger and the younger children, that so much of a person's formation happens at the very, very, very beginning of life. And so the right environment, adults who understand the children's communications, who are striving to live in harmony and not educate a child to fit into society, because that's kind of contrary to allowing for nature's plan to unfold in the child. They both realized that the secret was at the very beginning. Now, Maria Montessori, when she was in Barcelona, she wanted to start a school that would train young women to work with babies. She had an orphanage there that had babies through, teenagers. And she thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to train the young women, the 16, 17, 18-year-old girls in this orphanage to take care of the babies in a Montessori way? She had just had her first grandchild, and then her second. Mario and his wife were living there. And so she was going to the maternity ward. She was observing the newborns, and she had this plan, but it didn't ever come to fruition. So Maria Montessori was kind of, never able to apply her, her knowledge and wisdom from observing newborns and understanding the first moments, the first hours, the first weeks and months. The first part of life was so important to have people who were trained to help parents to, work with those children when they were in care. That never was realized in Maria Montessori's time until the very, very end of her life. So she passed away in 1952, and it was in 1946 that she and Adele Costa Gnocchi decided to together create this new project for the newborn, for the youngest. Mm-hmm. Adele as well had always dreamed of doing this, but there was never a moment in time. They had so many. They had World War I and then World War II, and it just never was able to happen. So in 1946, Maria Montessori came back to Italy for the first time after her years in India. During the war years, she was under house arrest there. So she came back to Europe when she was finally able to travel again, and came back to Italy and met with Adele Costa Gnocchi, and they basically put together their ideas. And Adele Costa Gnocchi said, I will do this in Rome. I will make this happen. And she opened the Assistenza all'Infanzia Montessori, so the assistance to infancy or childhood. The word infancia has many different shades, so it's actually childhood in its general translation. So she did kind of a test run, and then in 1947 found a group of, I think, about 18 or 19 young women. And Grazia Honegger Fresco was one of them. And Grazia told me that at the end of 2 years, I think there were only like 10 left.
Oh, wow.
But that was the very first group of trained people for working with the youngest. And they weren't being trained per se, as they were all learning together, because they were observing and meeting and discussing, and they were studying, just as her scuoletta was a research place for understanding children. I mean, every Montessori school in its essence should actually be a research place. You're learning from the children in front of you. And so that was what they did for the 0 to 3, was she had these students that were doing this Montessori training with her, but they were really just part of her research team, if you know what I mean.
Right. I feel like that aspect of observing and then discussing afterwards, I feel like that is at the heart of what we do with both Montessori and CGS, that I think in many ways we've lost a lot of that. Like I was talking with a dear friend of ours. Her name is Claudia Margarita Schmidt, and she worked with Sofia Cavaletti and Gianna Gobi closely for like 7 years in Italy. And she was telling me how that's what they did all the time. They would every Wednesday they had children in their home that did the atria time with them, and then they would go get food afterwards, and they'd sit and eat, and they would discuss what they all saw in the children for hours. And there's such richness to that. There's that scientific observation aspect of that, where you're honing your eyes to observe something and then discussing it with each other in order to understand fully what you saw, and if others see the same thing as well. Like there's a heart there of what we do that is in that. And that's really neat to hear that that's how Adele began the assistant to infancy formation, is with that.
Yeah, the Assistance to Infancy School, as it was called, ran for 2 years continuously. So every morning was your practical work, and every afternoon was your classroom time, whether it was lectures or discussions about the observations and practical work in the morning. Practical work meaning you'd spend 3 months going to the orphanage, you'd spend 3 months going to the maternity ward at the hospital, you'd spend 3 months going into, families with little babies or newborns. And so you can imagine, 10 to 20 women who, maybe 6 different locations in any given time. You've got this room full of people talking about what they experienced. And you've got this sounding board. And that's one thing that I've found here in Italy as well, in the programs that are the 0 to 3 programs, which it's confusing, but they call them nidos. In Italy, 0 to 3 childcare is a nido. So that word in the Montessori world in English has been turned into, under 18 months, not the toddlers, everybody but the toddlers, the youngest ones. But in the nidos in Italy today, the ones I've been fortunate to observe in, typically they have 3 or 4 different groups of children. So 60 children between the ages of 6 months and 3 years in, different classroom groups with different educators. But you imagine you've got a staff of 10 or 12 or 14 or 16, because you've got the cooks, you've got the cleaners, you've got this group of people who are working with this group of 60 children. And all 10 or 12 or 14 of these adults have 2 eyes to see. And so these meetings, like your friend was saying, where you sit down and talk about it, you talk about the children, and you have so much more to go on when you're confused why a behavior, what to put in, that's missing, what's going on for this child in the family, how can we support him, you've got a work group. In fact, they call it your work group. Many of us in Montessori toddler work, we work all by ourselves, because the Montessori school we work in has 1 toddler environment. We have an assistant or 2 that aren't trained in Montessori. So we're basically having to help them convert from traditional childcare methods to a Montessori, approach. And so we don't have a work group. We don't have 10 or 12 or 14 women that are, for the benefit of this group of children we're working with, are all brainstorming and discussing together. And I think it's a really fundamental, I think it's really important to look at that as far as what benefits children. Now, back to Adele Costa Gnocchi's Assistants to Infancy School. It ran for 2 years, and for 2 years you had this work group that talked all the time. And Grazia Honegger Fresco told me so many times I can't even count. She would say, Adele Costa Gnocchi never lectured about theory or topics. In fact, she talked very little. She instead would place a word into the circle, and we were to talk about it, what it meant, where we saw it. And so just like Montessori education for children is a place where they can construct their understanding, her Assistants to Infancy program was a place for these adults to construct their understanding.
That's fascinating.
And that's why I really feel like she took Montessori to the next level, because most of our Montessori trainings were given the information and we write it down and we repeat it. And this is traditional education, not Montessori education.
Right. So for this first assistant to infancy formation, was Maria Montessori with Adele doing it, or she just handed it over to her saying, okay, go with it?
Yeah, Maria Montessori was, one might say, the origin, but the consultant. She did come back to Italy again She was back in Italy in 1949. She had the International Congress in San Remo that year. So the assistants to Infancy School had 2 years of work, and they were able to report that at this, it wasn't an annual by any means Congress. I think every 4 or 5 years they had this Congress. It was the first one after the war years, I believe. So Adele Costa Gnocchi had been by Montessori's side since 1909. So 1949, they had 40 years of, Montessori's first group had 60-some students in 1909. And I think 15 of them were invited to stay on for 2 more weeks. And Adele was one of those. So she was handpicked by Montessori in 1909. Adele Costa Gnocchi went to every training, and I don't like that word, so I apologize using it because we aren't training people. And, but she went to every course that Montessori offered. So the 1910 course, the 1911 course, the 1912 course, these were all in Rome.
Couldn't get enough.
Well, no, you were basically part of Montessori's flock. So Montessori told you to come, you will come. I am going to be in Rome doing this, She went to every Congress, so those first, second, third, fourth, fifth Congresses that were all around Europe. And she was, again, one of the flock, to help. So she basically was in the inner circle, Montessori's inner circle. So the two of them worked very closely together to create the 0 to 3 work, meaning that they wrote letters. And when Montessori was in the country, Adele would have private, she was a hard person to spend time with at that point, being so incredibly, precious, the time with her. But Adele got to spend time with her one-on-one. We know from a lot of the writings. So they worked together from 1947 until 52 when Montessori passed away, consulting on it. But on the ground in Rome, doing the work, collecting the doctors, collecting the students, it was her work. It was her project.
Do you know who some of the other first collaborators with the Assistant to Infancy were besides Adele? Who worked with her and Maria on this, or was it just the two of them?
Well, let's see. So collaborators in the Montessori world, so what she had to do was she had to bring together a team to do this project. She needed doctors because she needed to, birth and newborns were in the healthcare field, not in the education field. She needed to find doctors who understood and were interested in healthy development and what, education from birth, healthy development for a child looked like, not what pathology was, because most doctors are trained just to, heal and fix and cure pathology. And she did find a handful of really amazing doctors. One was the head of the orphanage. It's not an orphanage, it was a foundling home. A brefatrofio means that it hosts single mothers with babies, illegitimate babies, so to speak. So they weren't all motherless babies, babies that were just brought there and dropped off. Women that were too poor to keep their babies, since there was at the time babies were getting thrown into the Tiber River because the women couldn't. So there was this incredible effort to save these babies, and so there was this very large institution, and the head of that was one of the doctors. Another one was the pediatrician at the Bambino Gesù, so Jesus Child Hospital, which is still the pediatric hospital in Rome. So she had some really important medical professionals that helped her because they were all professors, all the medical work that we learn in our Montessori 0 to 3 training, we do obstetrics and nutrition, and there's a whole handful of medical topics that are taught by the doctors themselves. She then needed her Montessorians, meaning people that were 3 to 6 Montessori pilgrims. I was about to say trained again, which I tend to want to stay away from that word. But and so I'm not really sure when Gianna Gobi did her, was in the school, the Assistants to Infancy School. I haven't looked up that date. Have you?
So that's a question I have, and I want to find the answer to. But it's my understanding that Gianna did Montessori training with Adele in 1939, but I'm not sure if that was 0 to 3 or 3 to 6.
Okay, so in 1939, Adele Costa Gnocchi was asked by Maria Montessori to teach the 3 to 6 in Rome, and it was quite clandestine because, as you can imagine, the fascists weren't interested in any more Montessori courses. Right. And Montessori was supposed to teach that, but she got trapped in India. She wasn't able to travel back. So Montessori selected Adele and Anna Maria Macaroni, I believe, were the two docents, the two Montessorians that taught that course. And so I think you're right. I think she did her 3 to 6 formation in 1939, and therefore was one of Adele's flocks. Mm-hmm. Many of the people that Adele worked with, the young women in her first years of the Assistants in Infancy School, had been students of hers in high school at the boarding school where she taught philosophy with the sisters, the Catholic boarding school.
And I think that was the case with Gianna. I think she was a student of Adele at the high school and then started working with her after that at the Montessori school.
Right. So that would explain why she was so incredibly deep in with her Montessori work.
And I think they worked together for a good while because she didn't introduce her to Sofia Cavalletti, and Gianna started collaborating with her till 1954. So that's about 15 years at least of them working at Adele's little school together before Gianna moved on to work with Sofia.
Yeah, Adele Costa Gnocchi felt like, everyone who works with children need to understand who the children are at the youngest age group. And so even if Gianna was focused on the older children, she spent years in that scuoletta and studied those youngest children. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of this, a lot of this information is available. Grazia Honegger Fresco wrote a biography about Adele Costa Gnocchi, where, she's the only Montessorian who wrote Adele's biography. The other two biographies are written by people who are perhaps more academically interested in Adele or religiously interested in her. Grazia talks about the beginnings of the catechesis work in this biography. There's a chapter on it, and it's got interviews with Sofia and with Gianna and with other people who bring a really rich set of memories. The other two biographies talk a lot about the different priests that she was really close with and collaborated with on other projects. And so there's different facets of her life from each of these three biographers, which is really interesting.
Is the book that Grazia wrote only available in Italian right now?
Yeah. All of these books are unfortunately still only available in Italian.
I guess I need to learn Italian. Add that to my list of things to learn.
It's such a beautiful language. Here's a quote. So in this book, in this biography, there's lots of, there's very few Adele Costa Gnocchi quotes floating around the world because she didn't write. She wrote letters for 50 years to her friends. She wrote letters to Montessori, but she didn't write, articles and books. So a lot of the quotes we have are the testimonials. People say, "Oh, Adele used to always say this," or "Adele said that." And so this one that is from this biography is Dio e il bambino se la intendano, which means God and the child understand each other. So this quote, God and the child understand each other. This was something Sophia remembered her saying. And she talked about how Adele Costa Gnocchi felt that it was necessary to integrate a child's education and the child's spiritual aspect of life. Mm-hmm. And that was something that Montessori, like they shared this desire to go deeper and back, and back farther into the younger children, to study them, to understand them, to provide what they could to others to understand them. Both Maria Montessori and Adele Costa Gnocchi also really wanted for the child to be respected in their spiritual development. And Adele Costa Gnocchi knew that from this quote, God and the child understand each other. The child is already in communion with God. Another thing that is in this book was about how so Sophia talks about how her first memories of knowing Adele Costa Gnocchi. So they lived, they didn't live across the street from each other. The scuoletta was across the street, across this little piazza from Sophia's house. Mm-hmm. And La Scuoletta was inside Palazzo Taverna, which was was friends. Count and Countess Taverna were friends of Adele's. And they have a palace in the center of Rome that's from the 15th century, their family home of this noble family. And they gave her a space in there to open up this little school. And so Sophia said, she just always remembers seeing Adele because she would be coming and going from, this palace in front of her house. She said her aunts were friends with Adele. But she has this first memory of seeing her helping someone who dropped all his oranges, and she just stopped and helped this man pick up all his oranges and put them back into his cart. She just had that, that kind of spirit of, helping others. And then the first time she was officially, brought into Adele's world was when she was in 1946 or 47. She couldn't remember the exact date. So this is when Sophia's remembering her first encounter, where she was invited to come. She must have already been a scholar, a historical researcher, because she was invited to come teach the elementary and middle school kids in a Montessori school that was run by Flaminia Guidi, who was a very important Roman Montessorian who's not really known by anyone outside of Italy. And so she was asked to teach the history of the alphabet to these kids. So that was her very first experience. And she said, and I believe it was at this middle school project that was another one of Adele's projects, that she did a public middle school for 5 or 6 years, right down the street from where she lived. So, a few blocks from her house, few blocks from the palace of the Count of Taverna. It all happened in a very small part of the, the center of Rome. Mm-hmm. And after this, she would be invited to come observe at La Scuoletta. And so at this point, the La Scuoletta was working with the 12-month to 36-month, the under 3 to 6 age group. They were starting to, this was 46, 47, 48, 49. It was in the early years of the La Scuoletta being for the youngest ones. And so Sophia probably was observing in the very early years of when they were all just trying to understand what these children need, who these children were, how they could provide an environment. And then she shared this really beautiful story about when she was observing in the scuoletta, and Adele said to her, they were watching a little girl who was totally immersed, just deeply concentrating on what she was doing. And Adele said, "Look, she's on a spiritual retreat."
Mm.
And isn't that just it? That when children are allowed to concentrate on what they find to be interesting, whether they're 3 months old or 3 days old or 3 years old, and they don't get interrupted because they're respected for that moment, they're really in this incredible union with life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's really neat to hear these stories because they happened before Sophia started working in what we now call catechesis of the Good Shepherd. But I see so many seeds that were planted in her. And like just what you said, Adele said, the spiritual retreat, like that's exactly what, when I see the children in our atria, I feel like we've created a retreat for them, a spiritual retreat. Like it's not classroom, it's not formation. It is a spiritual retreat where they have a place where they can encounter God in themselves. And it's so beautiful. It sounds like that those seeds were planted right there in that little school with Adele. That's really neat.
Yeah, it's a beautiful history to be researching. And sometimes I feel so lucky to be the one doing it. My dear friend Letizia Varone, who's the newborn person for the Montessori work, and she was in Adele Costa Gnocchi's class of 62 or 63, 64, in that time. So over 50 years of experience with the newborns. She's in her 80s and she's my dear friend. I can just call her up and ask her about things. And she still has her own personal historical memory of all of these people, of Sophia and of this work, and who I mean, it's really an incredible thing to, and this is why I moved to Italy, because it's at my fingertips, and it's worthy, I think, of being brought forward. Adele Costa Gnocchi was, another Maria Montessori in the sense that her life work was so important, and we really need to bring it into the present and take it into the future.
Yeah, I agree. I'm really grateful for you, Karin, of bringing us these stories and this history and helping us to understand a deeper who this beautiful woman, Adele Costa Gnocchi, was. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, Karin, before we finish, is there anything that you would like to share with us about your work, or anything that you think our listeners might want to hear?
Well, I would love to tell your listeners about this incredible opportunity to come to Rome and dip their own toe into this water. I have begun to do tours with a friend of mine who has Montessori Tours and Travel as her little, side gig, and the two of us have been leading people around Rome to Montessori sites. So we have a group coming over in the fall, September 30th to October 14th is the whole tour, but it's going to go from Italy all the way up to Amsterdam and look at Montessori sites up there too. And the Italy piece is September 30th to October 10th. And we're going to be running all over Italy looking at all the significant sites. So it's really an experiential education in Montessori history and in Adele Costa Gnocchi history, and all the work that happened in Rome, all the work that happened in, she was born in Chiaravalle, which is on the Adriatic seashore, and then her first course in Città di Castello. And we go to these places and we meet people that tell us about that piece of history, the specialists that can take us into this experiential education. We had our first one last year, and it was just amazing. So we're doing another one this year, and then we have one in June of 2024 that's just Rome, and we'll do 5 days just in Rome. So if anybody wants to know more about that, they should contact me, or Montessori Tours and Travel. Ruli is my friend who organizes it all.
Well, if you want to send me a link, I will put it in our show notes so that people can look into more information, because that sounds like an amazing trip. Its own little Montessori pilgrimage. Yeah,
and if you, I think you can do, both or one or the other. You can come just to Italy, or you can do the whole thing. But if you go to Holland, you stand in the room where Maria Montessori was born, and you stand in the room where Maria Montessori passed away. It's just this amazing opportunity, once in a lifetime opportunity.
Yeah.
So I'll send that link to you for the Montessori Tours and Travel site. And then, how we met, the Basic Needs of Babies course that we have put together, which is not necessarily a course about Montessori for the newborn. I realized the other day, we haven't talked about, the cestina and the toponcino and the mobiles. And, we really haven't been teaching people about how to Montessori for the youngest babies, because it's actually much more of a inner development of the adult course. And so we're going to be doing another edition of that course next coming September in the fall. And so I just would love to have anybody that would be interested in kind of spiritual development of the adult, who can become who the children need by, and Letizia says this to me all the time. Letizia, again, is this newborn Montessorian in Rome. She says, you have to do your inner work, you have to do your inner work. And Montessori trainings they tell you that inner work has to be done, but they don't necessarily guide you to how that might happen. And through this collaboration with Ruth Earhart, who is, a Montessori midwife, in the sense that she really understands how nature has a plan for birth and how to respect nature's plan, just as Montessorians understand that nature has a plan, or God has a plan for how a child educates himself to be peaceful. And we have to understand that plan in order to step out of their way and allow them to be in control of their lives from the beginning.
I have thoroughly enjoyed the course, and I highly, highly recommend it. We will definitely put links to that as well in our show notes for people who might be interested in that Basic Needs of Babies course that you provide through Montessori for Life.
Well, thank you so much for being in the course, because I've really enjoyed getting to know you, and just being with your group, with your work group, with your catechesis people who are so special.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Karin. Thank you for taking the time to join me today. I really appreciate you.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate having been able to spend this hour with you.
Thank you all for listening to this week's episode of the Good Shepherd and the Child podcast. Just like Karin and I were just speaking about, I have links in our show notes for Karin's work and her website, and some of the courses and the pilgrimages that she was all talking about. Go check out the show notes so that you can learn more about those things. I also want to point you to the book A Year with Sofia Cavalletti by Anne Garrido. In the chapters that Anne talks about who Sofia Cavalletti is and who Gianna Gobi is, she mentions in there some of the connections between Adele Costa Gnocchi and Sofia and Gianna. So if you have a copy of that book, go check out those two chapters so that you can see those links as well. And if you don't have a copy, I'll put a link in the show notes in case you want to get your hands on this really great book. Don't forget that we have Our main text, which is The Religious Potential of the Child by Sofia Cavalletti, we have it in audio form now. So if you would like to purchase access to the audio version of The Religious Potential of the Child, I have a step-by-step instructions how to do that in our show notes. So go check that out. This podcast is sponsored by the United States Association of the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. If you would like to know more about the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, or if you would like to become a member, support our work, and get access to member-only content, please go to cgsusa.org. Thank you all for listening. We will see you in 2 weeks. Go and fall more deeply in love with God.